Well, hello, beautiful moms, and welcome to our new semester. My name is Angela Bartlett, and I'm the Children's Ministry Director at the South Tampa campus. It is such a privilege to be here with all of you today. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about me and to share a little bit of my story, and I hope that it encourages you today. Today, actually, my husband and I are celebrating 30 years of our first date. So yes, 30 years ago, I went on a date with my Prince Charming. And since then, we've had 3 children. Scott Jr. is our oldest. He is 26. Stephen is our middle child. He is 23. And Rachel is 18 and will be heading off to college again here in the next week. If you had asked me 30 years ago what I thought my life would be like, I probably would have described a fairy tale. Each day, my Prince Charming coming home and sweeping me off my feet. I would get up in the morning and I would talk to all the woodland animals and sing songs to my children, and we would dance just like Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. Maybe you went into your marriage or family or having children with those same ideas, and I'm here to tell you, the last 30 years have been nothing close to a fairy tale. Not that it hasn't been great, and not that we haven't had wonderful times of celebration and life and accomplishments. I can tell you that the last 30 years have been filled with also less than ideal circumstances, some that have felt devastating and sad and lonely. And I wasn't ready for that when I was a young wife and a young mom. But something I learned those 30 years ago is what I want to share with you today that God has reminded me over these last years. And it comes from a story that we find in Genesis. So in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, it's the story of Hagar. And she was a maidservant in the house of Abraham and Sarah. Now, Abraham, we know, God spoke to Abraham and told him he was going to be the father of all nations, that he was going to have descendants that were so numerous that no one could count, like stars in the sky and sands and all of that good stuff. Well, God also told Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child, a son, and he would name him Isaac. Well, the funny thing was Abraham and Sarah were very mature in age. They were in their 80s, and so really, who would have thought that could even happen? So Sarah waited and waited and waited and just got really impatient with the waiting and decided to go along with the custom of that time and give her maidservant Hagar to Abraham to bear a child for them. Sarah was going to now bring about God's will for their life, right? Don't we love to do that? Anyway, Hagar goes with Abraham, and sure enough, they conceive. Well, I can't even imagine what Hagar must have felt like in the midst of that situation. I can't even begin to imagine what Sarah must have felt like in the midst of that situation. But what we do know is Hagar began to despise Sarah. And Sarah didn't like it. Sarah began to mistreat Hagar, and Hagar left their home. She fled their home and went running. Now, here's where God began to speak with me. The Bible tells us that an angel of the Lord found Hagar and began to speak to Hagar and began to speak into her life and began to speak into the life of her child. And Hagar just received that and was so overwhelmed by what God was telling her. She, in the book of Genesis, chapter 16, she says, "You are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me." And those words just really spoke volumes to me, that God actually cares about our situations. He cares about our circumstances. He doesn't just give us perfect circumstances to walk in. He's with us in the midst of those less than ideal circumstances. He sees me, and he sees you. Well, Hagar's story continues. She has the baby Ishmael. They raise Ishmael in Abraham and Sarah's house because, yes, God sent Hagar back to Abraham and Sarah's house, back to that less than ideal circumstance. Ladies, God doesn't always rescue us from those circumstances. Sometimes he wants us in the midst of them and promises to be with us in the midst of those circumstances. So Hagar goes back, raises Ishmael in their house for about 10 years, when Sarah finally conceives. And of course, we know she gives birth to their son, Isaac. Now, this was the Isaac that God told Abraham he was going to have, Isaac, the promised child. Well, Sarah takes a look at Ishmael and says, he's not going to share in my son's inheritance. And so once again, poor Hagar and now her son are sent back out into the desert. Sarah wants nothing to do with them. So Abraham packs a little to-go pack for Hagar and her son, some food, some water, and off they go. Well, of course, time goes by. They run out of food and water. The boy begins to cry, the Bible tells us. Hagar is just at her wit's end, again, in the midst of a less than ideal circumstance. She lays the boy under a tree. She goes a few steps away, drops to the ground, and the Bible tells us she began to sob. And God heard Hagar. He heard the boy crying. He heard the sobs that came from Hagar. And he once again spoke to Hagar, told her to get up, get your son. And God opened her eyes and showed her a well of water. And she brought her son to that well of water, and they drank. And God once again spoke into her life. Ladies, I want you to know that God sees you in the midst of those less than ideal circumstances. He hears your cries. One of the stories that I don't love to tell, but I tell because it was a very devastating time in my life. I had had my first son. Everything went well with that whole experience. He's a healthy young boy. And so my husband and I decide to have another child. And so a year later, I get pregnant, only to end up in a miscarriage 14 weeks later. I was devastated. I lost my child, the one that I protected on the very inside of me. I lost it. And that was just really sad. It was definitely one of those less than ideal circumstances. And so I went and I saw my doctor, and he said, give it a few months, Angela, you can get pregnant again. And I didn't want to wait a few months. Sounds like Sarah, right? I didn't want to wait a few months. I got pregnant pretty quickly after that. And as soon as I found out I was pregnant, ran to the doctor. We did an ultrasound. Yes, indeed, I was pregnant. I saw my little one. I saw that little one's heartbeat. And then I noticed that the heartbeat was very irregular. And before I could even ask, I looked up at the sonographer, and she looked at me, and I knew what was coming. I was about to miscarry my second baby. So I went home that day, told my husband what happened. I was feeling okay the next morning. He went to work. I put my son down for a nap. And then, for those of you who have miscarried, you know, the cramping began. I knew what was going on, and I was once again devastated. I laid on the ground and I sobbed and I begged God to not let this happen, to save my baby, to get this circumstance under control, and to make my baby well. It didn't turn out that way. But God saw me, and he heard my cry. And he showed me his great big hands holding my babies. And he said to me, I got you too. Little did I realize that those 4 words, I got you too, would carry me through the next 23 years of my life with my husband and my children. through, again, great experiences and some incredible tragedies, I kept hearing the words, "I got you too." Psalms 139 tells us that not only does God see us, not only does he hear us, but God truly knows us. He formed us in our mother's womb. He knows where we came from and where we're going. He knows when we sit and when we rise. He knows the very thoughts that are in our head. God knows you. And moms, I want you to know that God knows your children as well. I think one of the greatest desires of our heart is that our kids would grow in their relationship with God, and we can begin to tell them that God sees them, that God hears them, and then God knows them. About a year ago, my middle son, Stephen, was in a car accident. My husband had surgery that same day. We had been at the hospital since 5 in the morning. We had wandered in our house about 7:30 that evening, tucked Scott in bed, gave him a pain pill, thought we had crossed the finish line, and I get a frantic phone call from my son. And all I could hear was, Mom, I was in an accident." I didn't know what to say at that point. I didn't know what to do. A stranger then gets on the phone and says, "Your son was in an accident. We're not sure what happened. The paramedics are here. They'll call you." Click. Nothing. I heard nothing then. So all I could do was stand there and wait. And those minutes felt like hours. And all I could do is think, God, you know my son. You created him. God, you protect him. So a few minutes later, I got a call from the paramedic, and basically they just told me, "We have your son. We're bringing him to Lakeland Trauma Center. You're probably going to want to meet us there." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I'm on my way." I jumped into my car, and this is when I remembered the verse in Philippians. The verse in Philippians says, "Bring your prayers and your petitions to God with thanksgiving." So yeah, I knew God saw us. I know God hears us. And I know that God knows me. He knows my son. He knew the very situation. He was not surprised by it. But I didn't want to lose my boy. So I began to pray. But with that prayer, the thanksgiving began to flow. And moms, I want you to learn to give your prayers with thanksgiving. I began to thank God for the life that Stephen has had on this earth. I began to thank God that I could drive and stay on the road. I began to thank God for the doctors that were caring for him, for the nurses that were caring for him, for that bystander that I may never meet, but that took care of my son, for the nurses, for the staff, just for all of that. I began to give thanks. And the Bible tells us in that verse in Philippians that the peace of God will guard our hearts and our minds. And as I pulled up to that trauma center, I heard God say, "I got you, and I've got him too." Well, Stephen is alive today, and I'm so very, very grateful. But I'm also grateful to know that in the midst of those less than ideal circumstances, we can know that God sees us, he hears us, he knows us, and that we can have that peace and hope that no matter what our circumstances are, we can continue to take that next step each and every day. Moms, I want you to have that hope today. I want to pray for you right now, that you will just know God, that you will hear his voice and allow him to speak into your life and show you his provision that he has for you. So God, I just thank you so much for this time that you have allowed us to have. God, I thank you for each mom that is here, that they would know today, God, that you see them in the midst of every circumstance, whether it's celebrating or crying, whether it's rejoicing or whether it's just pure devastation. God, that you are there with them in the midst of their circumstances, that you hear the cries of their heart. God, I pray that we would be able to walk knowing in confidence that you created us, that you know us, and that nothing we step into the midst of is a surprise to you. God, I thank you today for the hope, for the strength, and for the joy that you give us. In Jesus' name, amen.